In the spring of 1870, a federal marshal traveling solo through the Choctaw Nation came upon 17 bodies, positioned in a flawless circle around a dying campfire. Each victim had been shot once directly between the eyes.
The cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
The marshal tallied the cards twice before the full meaning dawned on him. The deceased included Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, bounty hunters, and 3 deputies from his own Fort Smith, Arkansas office. They had ridden out together 6 weeks earlier with one mission.
They walked west with clothes on their backs because the South they'd known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark.
Like every pause before
Walker
them,
escaped at
they had
15 in
failed.
1861 during
The
the
cards in
chaos
their
of the
hands
early
spelled
war
out a message
and made his way
encoded
north through the
in a
Mississippi
system the
swamps to
marshal
Union
recognized
lines.
but could
The
not
movement
interpret.
here, it mirrors the crossing at
A cipher
Anti-Am, Chaplain.
that would
Indeed,
remain unsolved for
your
another
grasp
41
of the terrain
years.
is remarkable, son.
Long after every soul who understood
By the
it was
spring of
dead
1868,
and buried in unmarked
Walker had
graves
assembled around him a
scattered
band
across
so
3
improbable in its
states and
composition
Indian
that
territory.
federal...
There were 2 white men,
What the
both
marshal
Confederate
didn't know,
guerrillas who'd ridden with William
what
Quantrill
no
and had
white
no place
lawman
left in
would
the
grasp for
post-war world.
decades
A Missourian
was
named
that
Ellis
their quarry
Tatum.
had once been human chattel, sold at auction in Natchez, Mississippi for $940 to a cotton planter. That planter had branded him on the left shoulder with the initials JW, before sending him into the fields at age 11. Before we continue with the saga of Jeremiah Walker and the gang that nearly brought the U.S. government to its knees in the post-Civil War years, please do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which state you're tuning in from tonight, because what you're about to hear was locked away in classified federal files for over a century, and the descendants of those involved still live in towns from Oklahoma to East Texas. They never wanted this story told. Tonight, we're telling it anyway. To grasp how an ex-slave came to lead the most feared outlaw band in American frontier history, you must first understand the nation that forged him. A nation that had just ripped itself apart over whether men like him were human or property. The war ended in April 1860, but along the western edge of the former Confederacy, in the borderlands where Texas met Indian Territory and Indian Territory met Arkansas, the war never truly ended. It simply transformed. The Union Army pulled most of its troops to occupy the Deep South, leaving behind a sprawling, lawless region nearly the size of France, policed by fewer than 200 federal lawmen. Into that void poured every desperate soul the war had spawned. Confederate guerrillas who wouldn't surrender, Union deserters wanted for murder in 3 states, Comanche and Kiowa raiders pushed off their hunting grounds, Mexican vaqueros displaced by new Anglo cattle barons, Chinese laborers who'd finished the railroads and found themselves friendless in a hostile country, and tens of thousands of freedmen emancipated with nowhere to go and nothing to their names. They walked west with the seminary in Virginia, with the clothes on their backs because the South they'd known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark. The town of Boggy Depot sat at the heart of this chaos in the Choctaw Nation, about 40 miles north of the Red River. In the autumn of 1866, it was the kind of place where a man could buy a meal, a horse, or another man's life for roughly the same price. The streets were unpaved, and the buildings were hastily constructed from green cottonwood that warped and split as it dried.
The cards in their hands spelled out a
Giving
message
every door and
encoded in
window
a
a
system
crooked
the marshal
appearance,
recognized but could not interpret.
as if the town itself had been built by a drunk who couldn't remember how houses should fit
grasp
together.
how an ex-slave came
There
to
were
lead the
3
most feared
saloons,
outlaw
2
band
owned by
American
the same
frontier
Choctaw
history.
merchant,
The
Pushmataha
war
Folsom,
ended in April
a descendant of a
1865.
famous chief who'd
But
grown
along the
rich
western edge of the
selling
former
whiskey to
Confederacy,
soldiers during the war.
They walked west with the clothes
He
on
saw
their
no
backs
reason to
because the
stop
South
selling
they'd
it to
known had
outlaws.
become a
Now
slaughterhouse
that
for
the
any
soldiers
black
had
man
gone
caught
home,
alone after dark.
there was a single
Walker
store run
escaped
by
at
a
15
Scottish
in
trader
1861
named
during the
Angus
chaos
McRae,
of the early war
who
and
kept
made his
a
way
loaded
north through the
shotgun under
Mississippi
the
swamps
counter
to Union
and
lines.
a Bible on
The
top,
movement here, it
and was
mirrors the
known to
crossing at
settle
Anti-Am,
disputes
Chaplain.
with
Indeed,
whichever he found closer
your
to hand.
grasp of the terrain
There
is
was a
remarkable,
livery
son.
stable, a blacksmith, and a small adobe building that served as both jail and courthouse for whatever rough justice the Choctaw Lithours police.
There were two white men, both Confederate guerrillas who'd ridden with William Quantrill and had no place left in the post-war world. A Missourian named Ellis Tatum.
As the country sank deeper into disorder. Boggy deposed that autumn was less a town than a wound that had begun to scar over without healing properly underneath. Wagons rolled in at all hours from the south, from Texas, carrying men who wouldn't give their names and goods whose provenance no one asked about. Wagons rolled out at all hours toward the north, toward Fort Smith, carrying things that had once belonged to others. The graveyard at the town's edge, on a small rise behind the Methodist mission abandoned since 1863, had grown by 47 new graves in the 18 months since the war ended, only 9 of them belonging to people who'd died of natural causes. The rest had died, as the saying went in that country, of lead poisoning, rope fever, or the kind of accident involving a knife, a back, and a moonless night. The Choctaw Lithours Police, a small body of mounted lawmen authorized by treaty to keep order in the nation, had ridden through twice in the year before, both times after killings serious enough to embarrass the tribal government in Tuscaloosa. Both times they'd questioned a few witnesses, found nothing, and ridden away again, leaving Boggy Depot to settle its own accounts in its own way. The mission building still stood at the western edge of town, its roof half collapsed, the heavy oak doors hanging open. Inside, the children of the town and of passing strangers played among broken pews and a smashed pulpit, occasionally finding a torn page of hymnal or a fragment of colored window someone had thought worth shooting at. The town's smell was distinct. Anyone who'd spent time in such places would recognize it: horse manure, wood smoke, unwashed wool, cheap whiskey, and beneath it all, the faint but persistent odor of old blood soaked into the earth of certain alleys, impervious to any amount of rain. Into this town on a cold November morning in 1866 walked a black man of about 20, 6 feet 2 inches tall, lean as a coyote, wearing a Union Army cavalry coat with the chevrons of a corporal still stitched to the sleeve, and a wide, brimmed slouch hat pulled low over eyes the color of wet slate. He carried a Spencer repeating carbine across his back, 2 Colt Army revolvers at his hips in a cross-draw rig he'd cut himself from harness leather, and a Bowie knife in his right boot. He had no horse. He'd walked the last 60 miles.
The cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
Fair game for anyone wanting his weapons or his life.
To grasp how an ex-slave came to lead the most
feared
outlaw band American frontier
history. The reasons for that would become clear to the people of Boggy Depot in the months ahead.
The war ended in April 1865.
His name, he told Angus McCrae when he came into the store to buy salt.
They walked west
coffee,
with the clothes on their backs because the South they'd known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861 during the chaos of the early war and made his way north through the Mississippi swamps to Union lines.
With a discharge paper,
it mirrors
a
the
back
crossing
pay
at
voucher the Army refused to honor, and his former owner's brand still legible on his left shoulder.
By the spring of 1868, Walker had assembled around him a band so improbable in its composition
and his eyes on the
There were
door,
2 white men, both
recognized
Confederate
the look of a
guerrillas
man
who'd ridden with
who
William
long ago
Quantrill and had no
decided
place left
he'd
in the
never be
post-war
taken
world.
alive,
A Missourian named
and
Ellis
counted out
Tatum.
the goods without comment, even throwing in a small bag of dried apples. Years later, when McCrae was old and most of the people in this story were dead, he told a journalist from Satine, Louis, that he'd known from the moment Walker walked into his store that the country was about to change. Though he had no way of guessing how much. The scattered details of Walker's early life, recovered largely through the patient work of black historians at Howard University in the 1930s and 40s, paint a picture of a childhood designed to break a human being, and somehow, through some combination of accident and ferocious will, producing the opposite. He'd been born in 1846 on a cotton plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, the property of a planter named Josiah Whittington, who owned roughly 200 enslaved people and ran his operation on what he called scientific principles, meaning he'd read the agricultural journals of the period and concluded productivity could be maximized by breaking slave families apart and selling children when they reached working age, on the theory that workers without family attachments were less likely to escape and more focused on their tasks. Walker's mother, whose name in the plantation ledgers appeared only as Hannah, had been sold south to Louisiana when Jeremiah was 9. He never saw her again. His father, whose identity Walker himself never knew with certainty, was probably a free blacksmith from Natchez, who'd been allowed brief, tightly controlled visits to the plantation and disappeared from local records in 1853, possibly murdered, possibly fled. At 11, Walker was sold to a cotton planter in northern Louisiana. The man whose initials would be burned into his shoulder, who treated him with a casual brutality that was, by the standards of the time and place, neither unusual nor noteworthy. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861 during the chaos of the early war and made his way north through the Mississippi swamps to Union lines, where he was eventually directed to a recruiting station in Kansas, enlisting black soldiers for what would become the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. He served with distinction for 3 years. He learned to read in the regimental school, taught by a Quaker chaplain from Pennsylvania, who would later remember him in a published memoir as the most quietly intelligent young man he'd ever encountered.
The cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
It would make him a senior officer in any army that allowed
to grasp how an ex-slave came to lead the most feared outlaw band American frontier
history. The Union Army did not allow this.
The war ended in
Walker
April
was discharged to corporal,
1865.
having been recommended for promotion to sergeant on 3 separate occasions.
They walked west with the clothes on their backs because the South they'd known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861 during the chaos of the early war and made his way north through the Mississippi swamps to Union lines.
The movement here, it mirrors the crossing at Antietam,
in the records of the Choctaw Lighthorse,
Your
in the
grasp of the
dispatches
terrain
of the
is
federal
remarkable,
marshals
son.
at Fort Smith, in the
By the
private
spring of
correspondence of
1868,
Texas cattlemen,
Walker had assembled
and
around
in
him
the
a
oral
band so
histories
improbable
that
in its
black families
composition.
in eastern
that
Oklahoma
There were 2
still
white
tell
men,
their children,
both Confederate guerrillas who'd ridden with William
though now
Quantrill
they
and had
tell
no
them
place left
quietly,
in the post-war world.
because
a
the
Missourian
descendants
named
of
Ellis
those who
Tatum
hunted Jeremiah Walker still live in those same counties, and old grudges in that country have a way of outliving the men who first conceived them. By the spring of 1868, Walker had assembled around him a band so improbable in its composition that federal authorities at first refused to believe the reports they were receiving. There were 7 black freedmen, all former Union soldiers like Walker himself, including a Tennessee man named Cassius Pettigrew, who'd been a regimental scout and could read sign on Bear Rock. There were 4 Comanche warriors led by a man called Tabananaka, whose name meant Sound of the Sun, who had lost his entire family to a Texas Ranger raid in 1864 and saw the new alliance as a continuation of his war against white settlers by other means. There were 3 Mexican brothers from the Nueces Strip named Ignacio, Ramon, and Severino Quintanilla, whose father had been hanged by Anglo vigilantes during the so-called Cart War, and who brought with them the brutal efficiency of borderland feuds. There were 2 white men, both Confederate guerrillas who'd ridden with William Quantrill and had no place left in the post-war world, a Missourian named Ellis Tatum and a Kentuckian named Calvin H. Horton. There was an old Choctaw freedman named Solomon Beams, who had been the slave of a Choctaw planter before the war and now served the band as cook, scout, and unofficial diplomat with the 5 civilized tribes. And there was a woman, which the federal records found particularly difficult to accept. A black woman of perhaps 25 named Dilja Ransom, who'd escaped a Louisiana plantation at 15 and spent the war years working as a laundress for a Union cavalry regiment, where she'd learned to handle a pistol with both hands and to read maps with the quick instinct of a born tactician. She rode with the band as an equal, planned several of its most successful raids, and was, according to the only surviving photograph of her, a woman of striking and severe beauty, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed focused on something 100 yards beyond whatever was actually in front of her. The gang did not steal cattle, which is what made them dangerous. Cattle thieves were a known quantity in the territory, easily organized against, easily hunted down by the cattlemen's associations and the newly formed stock detective agencies.
The cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
Outlaw had previously imagined possible. Their first major operation in April 1868 was the robbery of a payroll wagon belonging to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, which was attempting to push its line west across Indian Territory. The wagon
They walked west with the clothes on their backs because the South they'd known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861 during the chaos of the early war and made his way north through the Mississippi swamps to Union lines.
The wagon was struck at 3 a.m. by a force the surviving guards estimated at 30 riders, though Walker's entire band never numbered more than 20.
By the spring of 1868,
the attack was
Walker
over
had
in
assembled
less
around
than
him
4
a band
minutes.
so improbable in its
3 guards
composition
were killed,
that Federalist
There were 2 white men,
Pinkertons.
both Confederate guerrillas who'd ridden with William Quantrill and had no place left in the post-war world.
The
A Missourian named Ellis
Tatum
Tatum
mules and carried east into the Kiamichi Mountains, where it disappeared into a network of caves the Choctaw freedmen had used as hiding places during the war. None of it was ever recovered. The surviving guards, when they were eventually able to give coherent statements at Fort Smith, spoke of an attack that didn't feel like an attack at all. There had been no shouted demands, no warning shots, no announcement of intentions. Instead, there had been a sudden silence, the kind that drops on a forest when a predator enters, the silence of every small animal holding its breath at once. The 2 lead horses pulling the wagon had collapsed simultaneously, killed by what proved on examination to be 2 perfectly placed rifle shots fired from a distance of more than 300 yards by marksmen the guards never saw. Then, the riders had emerged from the timber on both sides of the road, riding at a slow walk, their faces covered with dark cloth, their guns held at the ready but not pointed at anyone in particular. The way a man holds a gun when he is so certain of his ability to use it, that he sees no need to threaten. 3 of the guards, including the senior Pinkerton, attempted to draw their weapons. They were shot dead before their hands completed the movement. By riders no one saw aim. The other guards raised their hands. They were ordered. In a calm voice, one of them later described as sounding like a country schoolteacher giving instructions to a particularly slow class. To dismount, remove their gun belts, walk to designated trees, and put their wrists together behind the trunks. They complied. They were tied with cord that had been cut to exactly the right length in advance. They were searched, and any small valuables on their persons, watches, rings, small amounts of personal cash, were pointedly left untouched. Only the railroad money, the company money, had been taken. One of the guards, a young Pinkerton from Pennsylvania on his first Western assignment, began to cry. One of the masked riders dismounted, walked over to him, and offered him a sip from a flask of whiskey. The young man accepted. The rider patted him on the shoulder, returned to his horse, and rode away. By the time a passing freight wagon found them at dawn, the guards had been tied to their trees for nearly 5 hours. The only thing any of them could agree on
The cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
They had been, one guard said, soldiers.
To
The
grasp
kind
how
who'd
an
survived the
ex-slave
war
came to
by
lead the
becoming
most
better
feared
at
outlaw
killing
band
than the
American
people trying to
frontier
kill
history.
them. And then
The war
decided,
ended in April
for
1865.
reasons no one understood,
But along
to
the
keep
western
going.
edge of the former Confederacy,
What disturbed the Pinkerton
They walked
agency
west with the clothes
more
on their
than the loss
backs
of the
because
money
the
was
South they'd
discovery.
known had become a slaughterhouse
When
for
the
any black
surviving
man caught
guards
alone after
were
dark.
untied at dawn,
Walker escaped at
that each
15
of
in
them had been tagged
1861
with a
during the
small
chaos
piece
of the early
paper
war
pinned to
and
his
made his
shirt.
way north through the
The
Mississippi
papers all
swamps
said
to
the
Union
same thing in a
lines.
careful
The movement
schoolmaster's
here,
hand.
it mirrors the
We
crossing
could
at
have killed
Antietam,
you.
Chaplain.
indeed,
We chose not
your
to.
grasp of the terrain is remarkable,
Tell your
son.
masters that the next time the choice will be different.
By the spring of 1868,
The
Walker had
Pinkerton
assembled around
agency
him a
didn't know
band
what
so
to do with
improbable
this.
in its composition.
The agency
that
had
federal-
been
There were two
founded
white
20
men,
years
both
earlier
Confederate guerrillas
by a
who'd ridden with
Scottish
William
abolitionist
Quantrill and had no
named
place
Alan
left in the
Pinkerton,
post-war world.
who'd run
A
safe
Missourian named
houses on
Ellis
the
Tatum.
Underground Railroad, and who in his younger days would probably have understood what Jeremiah Walker was doing better than any man alive. But by 1868, Pinkerton had become the chief private police force of the American railroads and Eastern banking interests, and his agents in the field were instructed to treat Walker's band as a simple criminal conspiracy and bring in its members alive if possible, dead if not. The agency assigned its best man, a former Chicago detective named Patrick Donovan, to coordinate the hunt. Donovan was a hard man, an Irish immigrant who'd risen through the agency by being smarter and more ruthless than those around him, and he understood from the beginning that this would not be an ordinary chase. He arrived at Fort Smith in May 1868, sat down with the federal marshal there, a former Union general named James Fagan, and asked a single question. How does a man hide 20 riders, 4 of them Comanche, in country where every cattleman, every settler, every passing teamster will report a strange face within a day? Fagan had no answer. Neither did Donovan. The answer, when it finally became apparent 2 years later, would shock the federal government into a level of secrecy that kept the truth out of newspapers for the rest of the century. The answer was that Jeremiah Walker was not hiding. He was being protected by a network of people across 3 states and Indian Territory who had decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that whatever Jeremiah Walker was doing was something that needed to be done. The first hint of this network came in the summer of 1868, when a Pinkerton informant in the Choctaw town of Dokesville reported that wagons of supplies had been moving in and out of the Kiamichi Mountains for months with the apparent knowledge and cooperation of the Choctaw Lythorse police, who were turning a deliberate blind eye. Donovan investigated, found the informant murdered 3 days after he'd filed his report. His body left in the middle of the main street of Dokesville, with a single playing card pinned to his chest. The King of Spades. No one in Dokesville had seen anything. No one knew anything. When Donovan threatened to bring federal troops in, the Choctaw chief, a man named Allen Wright, a graduate of Union College who had once translated the Bible into the Choctaw language,
The cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
His entire life, and said only that the Choctaw Nation was a sovereign government.
To grasp how an
under the
ex-slave
treaties
came to
of
lead the most feared
1866,
outlaw band American
that
frontier
federal
history.
troops could not enter without
The
Choctaw
war ended
consent,
in April
and
1865.
that consent would not be given.
But along the western edge of
The
the former
implication was
Confederacy,
clear.
They walked west with the clothes on their
Walker had
backs
the
because the
protection of the
South they'd
Choctaw
known
government,
had become a slaughterhouse for
or
any
at
black
least of
man
enough
caught
of its
alone
officials
after dark.
to make the protection
Walker
effective.
escaped at 15 in
Donovan
1861
returned
during
to
the
Fort
chaos
Smith
of the early war
and sent a
and
long
made his way
telegram
north
to
through the
Pinkerton
Mississippi swamps
headquarters
to
in
Union
Chicago.
lines.
The movement here,
The response
it mirrors
from
the
Alan
crossing at
Pinkerton
Antietam,
himself,
Chaplain.
a
Indeed,
copy of which survives
your
in the
grasp of the
agency's
terrain
archives,
is remarkable, son.
was one of the strangest documents
By the spring
in
of
American law
1868,
enforcement history.
Walker had assembled
It
around him a
instructed
band
Donovan
so
to
improbable
proceed
in
with
its
the
composition.
investigation, but to
federal-
use
There were two white men, both Confederate guerrillas who'd ridden with William Quantrill and had no place left in the post-war world.
To public
A
attention.
Missourian named Ellis Tatum.
Pinkerton himself, the old abolitionist, seemed to understand that something complicated was happening on the southwestern frontier. Something that didn't fit neatly into the categories of law and crime. And he was reluctant to bring the full weight of his agency down on it, without first knowing what he would be destroying. If you're still listening, and I hope you are, then I want you to take a moment right now to hit that like button. Because the algorithm only shows this kind of buried American history to people who actively engage with it, and the families who've spent 150 years trying to keep this story buried have done a very effective job. Every like, every comment, every share helps another person discover what really happened in the territory in the years after the Civil War. And if you have a theory about what was really going on in the Kiamichi Mountains, leave it in the comments, because what we're about to discover is that the truth was stranger and darker than even Patrick Donovan was prepared to imagine. In the autumn of 1868, Walker's band struck again, this time hitting a stagecoach carrying gold from the Choctaw Nation's annuity payment, money the federal government had owed the tribe under the Treaty of 1866, and had finally agreed to pay in coin rather than the depreciated paper currency the tribes had learned to refuse. The coach carried 19 Zalozans in gold double eagles. It was guarded by a detachment of the 6th United States Cavalry. The cavalry detachment was wiped out. 8 troopers killed in a single volley from rifles fired from positions on both sides of the road, and the gold was taken. But this wasn't what made the robbery famous. What made it famous was what Walker did next. Within 2 weeks, every Choctaw freedman family in the eastern half of the Choctaw Nation had received, by means no investigation could ever quite trace, a small leather pouch containing exactly $20 in gold double eagles. There were nearly 700 such families in the affected area. The math worked out almost exactly to the amount stolen, with a small remainder the freedmen insisted had been used to buy school books for the children. The federal investigators who interviewed these families found, to their fury, that none of the recipients would say a word about who brought the gold or how it had arrived. The pouches simply appeared
the cards
on
in their
doorsteps in the
hands
night
spelled
with
out
no
a message
note, no
encoded in a
explanation.
system the marshal recognized
pressed,
but could not interpret.
The freedmen said only that the Lord worked in mysterious ways.
To grasp how an ex-slave came to lead the most feared outlaw band American frontier history.
Patience,
The war ended in April
ancient amusement the
1865,
agents found impossible to penetrate.
but along the western edge of the former
Patrick
Confederacy,
Donovan understood.
They walked
when he
west
read
with the clothes on their backs because the South they'd known had become a
Walker was
slaughterhouse
not a
for
thief.
any black man
He
caught
was not
alone
even,
after dark.
in the conventional
Walker
sense,
escaped
an
at
outlaw.
15 in
He was a
1861 during the
redistributor,
chaos of the early
an
war
inverted
and
Robin
made his way
Hood
north through the
operating
Mississippi
in a
swamps to
post-war
Union
landscape
lines.
The
where
movement
the federal
here,
government
it mirrors the crossing
had
at
failed
Antietam,
in its
Chaplain.
most basic
Indeed,
obligations to the
your
people
grasp
it had
of the
freed,
terrain is remarkable, son.
and where the railroads and cattle barons
By the spring of
were busily
1868,
seizing
Walker had
every
assembled around
acre
him
of
a band
land
so
and every
improbable in its
dollar of
composition
wealth they could
that
get
federal
their
There were
hands
2 white
on
men,
before
both Confederate
anyone could
guerrillas who'd ridden
organize
with William
effective
Quantrill and had no
resistance.
place left in the
Walker was
post-war world.
resistance.
A
By the
Missourian
spring of
named Ellis Tatum.
1869, the band had carried out at least 11 major operations, including the robbery of 2 more railroad payrolls, the looting of a Wells Fargo Express office in Texarkana, the interception of a herd of Texas cattle being driven north to Kansas by a syndicate of speculators who'd cheated a number of Comanche families out of their treaty grazing rights, and a daring raid on the Bank of Sherman, Texas, which had foreclosed on dozens of small farms owned by freedmen and Mexican families during the Panic of 1867. The bank's vault was emptied of a 41 Zalozan. The bank's records, including the foreclosure files, were burned in the street. Within a month, deeds to the foreclosed properties began appearing in the mail of the dispossessed families. accompanied by notarized statements indicating the bank had reconsidered its position and was returning the land. The notary stamps were forged, but the deeds themselves were genuine. They'd been removed from the bank's vault during the robbery, and someone with extensive legal knowledge had transferred them properly through the county recorder's office, using a clerk who'd been bribed, blackmailed, or otherwise persuaded to cooperate. The federal authorities tried to challenge the deeds in court. The court, presided over by a judge appointed during Reconstruction and sympathetic to the freedmen, ruled that the transfers were legal on their face and that the federal government had no standing to contest them. The dispossessed families kept their land. The bank, ruined by the loss and the publicity, closed its doors within 6 months. Patrick Donovan, reading the reports in his Fort Smith office, began to develop what he later described in a private letter to his wife as a peculiar admiration for his quarry. An admiration he found morally troubling and professionally dangerous. He wrote that he'd begun to understand why Walker had become a folk hero in the territory, why the songs about him sung by black families in the Cotton Bottoms had begun to spread to the cattle camps and railroad work crews, why even some white settlers, particularly small farmers and Confederate veterans who'd themselves been ruined by the war, were starting to view Walker not as an outlaw, but as a man taking back some small fraction of what had been stolen from everyone who wasn't rich enough to be on the winning side of the new
The cards
American
in their hands
economy.
spelled out a message
Donovan
encoded in
understood
a
all of
system
this,
the marshal
and he also
recognized but could
understood
not
that his job
interpret.
was to capture or kill Jeremiah Walker, and that his job
To
was not
grasp how an
negotiable.
ex-slave
In
came
the
to
summer
lead
of
the most feared outlaw
1869,
band American
Donovan made
frontier
his
has
first
come.
serious attempt.
The war
He
ended
assembled
in
a force
April
of 40 men, 20
1865.
Pinkerton agents,
But along the western
12
edge
Texas
of the former
Rangers
Confederacy,
under the command of a
They walked
notorious
west with the
captain
clothes
named
on their
Leander
backs
McNelly,
because the South they'd known
and
had
8
become a
federal marshals
slaughterhouse
from
for
Fort
any
Smith.
black man caught alone
The
after
force
dark.
was equipped with
Walker
New Henry,
escaped at
repeating
15 in
rifles,
1861
plenty
during
of
the chaos
ammunition,
of the early war
and the best
made his
horses
way
the
north through
agency
the
could
Mississippi
buy.
swamps to Union lines.
They'd
The
received
movement
intelligence
here,
from an
it mirrors the
informant,
crossing at Antietam,
a
Chaplain.
freedman named
Indeed.
Cyrus Burdett,
Your
who'd
grasp
briefly
of the
ridden
terrain
with
is
Walker's
remarkable,
band
son.
and had been turned by the offer of a federal
By the spring of
pardon and farther
1868,
$1,000
Walker had
in
assembled around him a
cash.
band so improbable in its
Walker's main
composition
camp was
that
in a
federal
hidden
There were two
valley
white
in
men,
the
both
Kiamichi
Confederate
Mountains,
guerrillas who'd ridden with
called by
William
the
Quantrill and
Choctaw
had
the
no
Valley
place
of
left
the
in the post-war
Whispering
world.
Pines, accessible
A Missourian
only
named
through
Ellis Tatum.
a single narrow defile the band kept guarded day and night. Donovan's force rode out from Fort Smith on the morning of June 3, 1869. They were to rendezvous with Burdett at a crossroads near the town of Tuskahoma, where he would lead them by a back route into the valley, bypassing the main defile. They reached the crossroads at dusk. Burdett was waiting for them. He was sitting against a tree, his hands tied behind his back, his throat cut from ear to ear, his eyes still open. Pinned to his shirt was a playing card, the King of Spades. Donovan understood instantly what had happened. Burdett had been doubled. He'd pretended to take the federal money while reporting everything he learned back to Walker. Walker had used him to lure the federal force into a trap. Donovan ordered his men to spread out into a defensive perimeter and prepare for an attack. The attack came at moonrise. The moon that night was a 3/4 moon, rising late and bright through the pine tops, and the men who survived what happened next would never afterward sit comfortably in a dark forest, hear horse hooves on pine needles, or smell wood smoke on a summer night without feeling the hair on their arms stand up. It came from every direction at once, from positions the band had clearly prepared days in advance, with crossfires that pinned the federal force in a small clearing surrounded by dense timber. The first volley killed 6 men in the space of a single breath. Men who'd been standing or kneeling in positions they imagined offered some protection, but that had, in fact, been chosen for them by marksmen in the trees, who'd used the federal force's own defensive instincts to guide them into the kill zone. The return fire was wild. The federal men fired at muzzle flashes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that moved between shots and never came twice from the same position. Captain McNelly of the Texas Rangers, a famously aggressive officer who'd spent 4 years fighting Mexican bandits along the Rio Grande, attempted to lead a charge into the timber on the south side of the clearing. He was shot through the neck before he'd taken 5 steps and died slowly over the next 10 minutes, while his men, crouched behind fallen logs, watched him bleed and were unable to move to help him without drawing the same fire. The voice of Jeremiah Walker
The cards
himself,
in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized
called out at one
but could
point
not
from
interpret.
somewhere in the darkness, in English clear enough to carry across the clearing,
To grasp how an
telling the federal
ex-slave
men
came
to
to
lay
lead the
down
most
their
feared
weapons
outlaw band
and stand
American
up with their
frontier
hands empty, and
The
they
war
would not
ended
be
in
killed.
April 1865.
Donovan,
But along the
bleeding from
western
a
edge of
shoulder
the former
wound that nearly
Confederacy,
killed him,
They walked
made
west
the
with the
decision
clothes on
he
their
would
backs
second.
because the South they'd known
Yes, for
had
the
become a
rest of his
slaughterhouse
life,
for any
he
black
ordered his
man
men
caught
to
alone
surrender.
after dark.
The fight
Walker
lasted
escaped
less
at
than an
15
hour.
in
When it
1861
was over,
during the chaos of the
16
early
of
war
Donovan's 40
and made his
men
way
were
north
dead.
through the Mississippi swamps
12
to Union
more were
lines.
wounded.
The movement here,
The remainder,
it mirrors the
including
crossing at
Donovan
Antietam,
himself,
Chaplain.
who'd
Indeed,
been hit in the shoulder
your grasp
by a
of the
rifle
terrain is
ball,
remarkable, son.
were stripped of their weapons, their
By the
horses,
spring of
and their
1868,
uniforms,
Walker
and
had
left to
assembled
walk
around
the
him a
40
band
miles
so
back to
improbable
Fort
in its
Smith in their
composition
underclothes.
that federal
There were 2 white men,
None
both
of Walker's
Confederate
band,
guerrillas who'd ridden
as
with
far as
William
anyone
Quantrill and
could
had no
tell,
place left
had
in the
been
post-war
killed
world.
or even
A
wounded.
Missourian named Ellis
When
Tatum.
Donovan staggered into Fort Smith 3 days later, sunburned and dehydrated, with a tag pinned to his bare chest reading the same 5 words that had appeared on the wagon guards a year earlier. Federal Marshal James Fagan sent a telegram to Washington requesting authorization to raise a force of regular Army cavalry, at least a regiment, to clear the territory of what he called, in the language of the time, the Negro insurrectionary band led by the freedman Walker. The War Department's response, when it finally came, was to deny the request. The reasons for the denial wouldn't become clear for another 50 years, when the relevant files were finally opened to historians. The truth, which the War Department understood and James Fagan did not, was that Jeremiah Walker's operations had become entangled in a much larger political conflict involving the Reconstruction policies of the Grant administration. The question of the legal status of the freedmen in the Western Territories and the desperate efforts of the railroads and cattle interests to seize control of Indian Territory before any effective federal authority could be established there. To send a regiment of cavalry into the territory to hunt down a band that included Comanche warriors and was protected by the Choctaw government would, the War Department feared, trigger exactly the kind of larger Indian war General Sherman was trying to avoid. It would also, less officially but perhaps more importantly, draw national attention to the fact that the federal government was failing catastrophically to protect the freedmen and was, in many respects, allowing the South to reimpose a system of de facto slavery through the convict lease system, the black codes, and the rising tide of Klan violence the federal authorities were either unable or unwilling to suppress. Walker was an embarrassment. The cavalry would make him a martyr. Better to let the Pinkertons handle it quietly, out of the public eye, and hope the problem would eventually solve itself through the slow attrition of arrests, betrayals, and natural causes that eventually consumed every outlaw band. This was the policy the Grant administration adopted. Patrick Donovan was instructed to continue his pursuit with whatever resources the agency could provide and to keep the matter out of the newspapers. Donovan, who
The
nearly
cards in their
died in the
hands
valley
spelled
of
out
the
a
Whispering
message
Pines,
encoded in a system the
accepted his
marshal
orders with a
recognized
grim
but could
sense of
not
having
interpret.
finally understood the kind of country he was working for.
To grasp how an
What followed was
ex-slave
3
came to
years
lead
of
the
a
most
strange,
feared outlaw band
slow,
American frontier
deeply secret
history.
war fought in the canyons,
war ended in
bottoms,
April
and small towns of
1865.
Indian Territory,
But along
the
the
Texas
western edge of the
borderlands,
former Confederacy,
and the cotton districts
They
of
walked west
southwestern
with the clothes
Arkansas.
on their backs because the South
Walker's
they'd
band
known had
continued
become
to
a
operate,
slaughterhouse for any black
hitting
man
selected
caught alone
targets
after
with
dark.
surgical precision.
Walker escaped at 15 in
Never striking the
1861
same
during the
place
chaos
twice.
of the early war,
Never
and made his way
killing more than
north
the
through the
operation
Mississippi
required.
swamps to Union lines.
Always leaving
The
behind
movement
their
here,
playing
it
cards and
mirrors the
tagged
crossing at
messages.
Antietam, Chaplain.
They
Indeed.
robbed 2 more bank
Your
vaults,
grasp of the
3
terrain is
more
remarkable,
railroad
son.
payrolls, an army quartermaster
By
wagon
the spring of
carrying 60 of
1868,
Zalozans in cash
Walker
for
had
the
assembled
supply of
around him a
frontier
band so
garrisons,
improbable
and,
in its
most
composition
spectacularly,
that Federal
There were
in
2 white
October
men,
1870,
both Confederate
they
guerrillas who'd
attacked
ridden with William Quantrill and
looted
had
a
no
riverboat
place left in the post-war
called the
world.
Memphis Belle,
A Missourian named
as it
Ellis
lay
Tatum.
tied up at a wood landing on the Arkansas River. Taking an estimated 90 Zalozan in cash and bullion, the boat was carrying south for a consortium of New Orleans cotton factors. In each case, the proceeds disappeared into the network of caves. Sympathetic farmers and quietly bribed officials Walker had constructed across 3 states. In each case, within weeks of the robbery, freedmen families, dispossessed Indian families, ruined small farmers, and Mexican families displaced by Anglo cattle barons would receive small, unmarked packages of cash. Deeds returned from foreclosure. Livestock stolen from them years earlier reappearing at their gates with no explanation. Walker had built, in effect, a parallel economy, a redistributive system funded by armed expropriation from the largest concentrations of capital in the post-war economy, and operated through a network of mutual aid that crossed every line of race, religion, and language in the borderlands. Patrick Donovan understood all of this, and the more he understood it, the more he found himself, against his will and against his orders, beginning to admire the man he'd been sent to destroy. He wrote in his journal, which his granddaughter would discover in an attic in Chicago in 1947, and eventually deposit at the Newberry Library, that Walker was the most dangerous man in America. Not because he was killing white people, but because he was demonstrating that an alternative to the developing American economy was possible, and that this alternative could be defended by men and women willing to die for it. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Kiamichi country intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The thing that finally broke the band, the thing no investigation by the Pinkertons or federal marshals had been able to accomplish, was something no one had foreseen. It was not betrayal, though there had been many attempted betrayals over the years. It was not military force, though Donovan continued to assemble and dispatch posses with grim regularity. It was, in the end, a combination of personal grief and strategic miscalculation, the same combination that
the cards
has
in their
destroyed
hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
In the spring of 1872, Dilja Ransom was pregnant.
To
The
grasp
father
how an
was Jeremiah
ex-slave came to
Walker
lead the
himself,
most feared
with whom
outlaw
Dilja
band
had been
American
intimate.
frontier history.
The records suggest,
The war ended
since
in
at least
April
1868,
1865.
though their
But along the
relationship
western edge
had
of the
been
former
carefully
Confederacy,
concealed even from the
They
rest of
walked
the
west
band.
with the clothes on their
Both
backs because the
because
South
Walker
they'd known
believed
had become a
personal
slaughterhouse
attachments
for any
made a
black
man
man caught
vulnerable,
alone after
and
dark.
because Dilja
Walker
herself
escaped at
had
15 in
insisted on operating
1861
as an
during the
equal
chaos of the
commander,
early war,
not
and
as
made
a
his way
wife or
north through the
consort.
Mississippi swamps
The
to Union
pregnancy
lines.
changed everything.
The movement here,
Walker,
it mirrors the
who'd
crossing at
survived a
Antietam,
childhood
Chaplain.
in slavery,
Indeed.
3 years of war,
Your grasp of
and
the
4
terrain is
years as the
remarkable,
most
son.
hunted man in the Western Territories.
By the spring of
Found
1868,
himself,
Walker had
for the
assembled
first
around him a
time in his
band
life,
so improbable in its
confronting the
composition
possibility
that
of
Federal-
something
There were 2 white men,
he'd never
both
allowed
Confederate
himself to
guerrillas who'd
imagine
ridden
a
with
future,
William Quantrill and
a
had no
child,
place left in the
a
post-war
family.
world. A
The
Missourian
record
named Ellis
suggests he and
Tatum.
Dilja began in the summer of 1872 to plan their withdrawal from the band. They wouldn't abandon the operations entirely, but they would shift to a quieter role. advisory rather than operational, allowing younger men like Cassius Pettigrew and Tabananaka's nephew, a young Comanche warrior named Poit Quasho, to take over leadership. Walker and Dilja would relocate with the child to a small farm in the Choctaw Nation that had been quietly purchased in Solomon Beam's name, where they would try to live for whatever years remained to them as ordinary people. It was a beautiful plan. It was a sentimental plan. It was, as Walker himself probably understood, a plan no man in his position had any right to make. The plan was discovered by Patrick Donovan in October 1872 through a piece of dumb luck so improbable that Donovan himself, in his journal, attributed it to the direct intervention of God, in whom he had not previously believed. A Choctaw freedman named Ezekiel Folsom, distantly related to the saloon owner Pushmataha Folsom and to the Choctaw chief, had been arrested in Fort Smith on a charge of horse theft. To save himself from a long sentence, he offered information he'd heard from his cousin, who worked at the recorder's office in Tuskahoma, that a deed had recently been registered for a small farm near the town of Atoka in the name of Solomon Beams. Folsom didn't know who Solomon Beams was. He didn't know why this information should be valuable. He offered it as part of a list of small bits of gossip he hoped would buy his freedom. Donovan, sitting across the desk from him, recognized the name instantly. He'd seen it in the reports for years, mentioned in passing as one of Walker's associates. The deed was the first concrete connection between Walker's band and a piece of identifiable fixed property anywhere in the territory. It was a thread. Donovan pulled it. What he found when he pulled the thread was the entire pattern. The farm at Atoka had been purchased with cash. The cash had been deposited in a bank in Sherman, Texas by a freight agent named Augustus Blandon. Blandon had received the cash from a Choctaw merchant named Cyrus Pitchlin. Pitchlin was the brother-in-law of Pushmataha Folsom, the saloon owner in Boggy Depot. Pushmataha Folsom was the principal supplier of whiskey to the Kiamichi Mountains. By following the money,
the cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized
to map the
but could
entire
not
commercial
interpret.
infrastructure of Walker's network. Every saloon keeper,
To grasp how an
every freight
ex-slave
agent,
came to lead the
every
most
bribe
feared
clerk,
outlaw band
every
American frontier
sympathetic
history.
farmer who'd been moving
The war
supplies and
ended in
information
April
for the band
1865.
for the past 4 years.
But along the
He did
western
not
edge
move
of
on
the
any
former
of them.
Confederacy,
Instead, he
They walked
waited,
west with the
he
clothes on
compiled.
their backs
By
because the
February
South they'd known
1873,
had become a slaughterhouse
Donovan
for
had
any black
assembled a
man
list
caught
of
alone after dark.
147 individuals
Walker escaped
across
at
3
15 in
states and Indian
1861 during the
territory
chaos
who
of
were
the early
materially
war
involved
and made his way
in
north through the
supporting
Mississippi
Walker's
swamps to
operations.
Union lines.
He'd
The
also
movement
identified,
here, it
with
mirrors the
reasonable
crossing at
confidence,
Antietam, Chaplain.
the location
Indeed.
of the farm at
Your
Atoka
grasp of
where
the terrain
Walker
is
and
remarkable,
Dilja
son.
Ransom were planning to retire
By the spring
after
of
the birth of their
1868,
child.
Walker had assembled
Expected
around
in
him
the
a
late
band
spring.
so improbable in its
Donovan did
composition
something then
that federal
no
There were 2
Pinkerton
white men,
agent
both
had done
Confederate
before.
guerrillas who'd ridden
He
with
went
William Quantrill and
directly
had
to
no
Allen
place left in the
Pinkerton
post-war
himself in
world.
Chicago
A
and laid
Missourian
out
named
the
Ellis
entire
Tatum.
case. He explained what Walker had built. He explained what the network was, what it did, why the freedmen and Indians and Mexican families and ruined white farmers were protecting it. He explained that any attempt to destroy the band by force, even now, with all this intelligence in hand, would create martyrs and harden the network into a permanent insurgency the federal government would never be able to suppress without a level of violence that would be politically impossible. He proposed instead a different approach. He proposed to make Walker an offer. The offer, as Donovan finally presented it through an intermediary in March 1873, was this: Walker and Dilja Ransom could keep the farm at Atoka. They could keep their unborn child. They would receive federal pardons, signed personally by President Grant, for all crimes committed by them or by any member of their band during the years of operation. In exchange, they would disband the band, return to private life, and use their remaining moral authority among the freedmen and Indian peoples of the territory to discourage any further organized resistance to the federal government and the developing American economy. They would, in effect, sell out. The intermediary was Solomon Beams, the old Choctaw freedman cook whom Donovan had been holding in protective custody at Fort Smith for 2 months without filing any charges. Donovan had treated Beams well, fed him at the marshal's table, allowed him to write letters to his family. He'd also explained to him, with patient clarity, what would happen to the entire network of 147 people, including Beams's own wife and 3 children. If the offer was rejected, Beams understood. He carried the offer back into the Kiamichi Mountains. He delivered it to Walker personally in the Valley of the Whispering Pines on a cold March evening in 1873. What was said between them is not recorded, because Solomon Beams refused for the rest of his long life to discuss it with any white man. And the only people he ever told the full story to were 3 black ministers in eastern Oklahoma, all of whom died without writing it down. What is known is that Walker accepted the offer. He understood, the way Donovan had hoped he would understand, that the cost of refusal would be paid not by him, but by everyone who'd stood with him for the past 5 years.
The cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
Or his own continued resistance. The plan was set for the night of April 17, 1873. Walker would meet Donovan at a remote cabin near the Texas border, where the formal pardons would be signed and the disbandment would begin.
But along the western edge of the former
Walker
Confederacy,
would come alone.
They walked west
Donovan
with the clothes on their
alone.
backs because the South
The
they'd
agreement was
known had become a
witnessed by
slaughterhouse
Solomon
for any
Beams
black man
and
caught
by a
alone
Choctaw
after
judge
dark.
named Allen
Walker
Wright.
escaped at 15 in
The
1861
same
during
Allen
the
Wright
chaos
who'd
of the
been
early
chief of the
war
nation
and made his way north
when
through the
Donovan
Mississippi
first
swamps to
investigated
Union lines.
the
The
Dokesville
movement
murder
here,
5
it
years
mirrors the
earlier,
crossing at Antietam,
and
Chaplain.
who'd agreed,
Indeed.
after considerable
Your
pressure,
grasp of the terrain is
to
remarkable,
serve as
son.
guarantor of the federal government's good faith.
By the spring of
Walker
1868,
arrived at the cabin
Walker
at
had
midnight
assembled
on
around
April
him a band
17,
so
alone
improbable
on
in
a
its
horse,
composition
carrying
that
no
Federal-
weapons.
There were 2 white men,
Donovan
both
was
Confederate
waiting for
guerrillas
him.
who'd ridden with William Quantrill
pardons
and had
were
no
signed.
place left in the post-war
The 2
world.
men shared a
A
bottle of
Missourian
whiskey.
named Ellis Tatum.
The first time, Walker remarked, he'd ever drunk with a white lawman. They talked for several hours about the war, about the territory, about the future. Donovan, in his journal, wrote that Walker spoke of his unborn child with a softness he hadn't expected from a man who'd killed perhaps 50 other men over the course of his career. He wrote that Walker had asked him, at one point during the long night, whether he thought the Grant administration would actually honor the pardon, whether it would hold in any court, whether the land at Atoka would remain in his name if some ambitious prosecutor decided to challenge it 5 years from now. Donovan had said, honestly, that he didn't know. He said he'd done everything he could within his authority to make the agreement binding, that the pardon bore the president's signature, that the Choctaw Judge Allen Wright had agreed to serve as witness and guarantor, but that the United States government was not in the habit of keeping its promises to black men or to Indians, and that Walker would be a fool to trust any piece of paper that came out of Washington. Walker had smiled at this, a small, private smile Donovan would remember for the rest of his life, and said only that he was tired, that he'd been tired for 10 years, and that he'd decided a foolish trust was preferable to the alternative to spend the rest of his life running from men like Donovan, to raise his child on the run, to watch his child grow up, expecting to be killed the way his father and grandfather had been killed. He said he'd made his peace with the possibility the pardon wouldn't hold, and that if it didn't, at least he would have tried. He said that was what he was giving up the band for. Not the farm, not the pardon, but the chance, however small, of a life not defined by the expectation of violence. They parted before dawn. Walker rode north back toward the Choctaw Nation and the farm at Atoka, where Dilger was waiting. Donovan rode east back toward Fort Smith with the signed agreement in his saddlebag. What happened next was something Patrick Donovan had not anticipated, and no one in the federal government had anticipated. And it demonstrated, with terrible finality, that the network Walker had built was not actually under Walker's control, and had perhaps never been. The 17 men who'd been hunting Walker for the previous 6 weeks.
The cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
Whose bodies the marshal would find a few weeks later, arranged in their perfect circle around the dying campfire,
lead the most feared outlaw band
had not
American
known
frontier
about Donovan's negotiation.
The war ended in April
They'd been operating under older orders
but
to
along the
capture or
western
kill
edge of the
Walker
former
on sight.
Confederacy.
They walked west with the clothes on their backs because the South they'd known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861 during the chaos of the early war and made his way north through the Mississippi swamps to Union lines.
In a small ravine
the movement
about
here,
12 miles south of the Red River in Texas.
Indeed.
They surrounded him.
Your grasp of the
They
terrain is
demanded his
remarkable,
surrender.
son.
Walker, who
By
was
the spring
carrying
of
no weapons,
1868,
because
Walker had
he'd
assembled
ridden to
around
the
him a
meeting
band
with
so
Donovan,
improbable in its
unarmed as a
composition
gesture of good
that
faith.
Federal
There were two white men,
Raised his
both
hands and
Confederate
showed
guerrillas
them
who'd
the
ridden
signed
with William
federal
Quantrill
pardon.
and had no place left in the
leader of
post-war
the
world.
posse,
A Missourian
a
named
Texas
Ellis
Ranger
Tatum.
captain named Moriah Hollister, took the pardon, read it, and threw it on the ground. He told Walker he didn't recognize the authority of any pardon issued by the Grant administration, that his orders came from the state of Texas and from the cattlemen's associations that funded his work, and those orders had not changed. He gave Walker 30 seconds to draw a weapon and defend himself. Walker, who still had no weapons, simply stood there. Hollister shot him through the chest from a distance of 12 feet. Walker fell. Hollister rode forward, dismounted, and put a second bullet through Walker's head as he lay dying in the dust. He then ordered the body to be hung from the nearest tree as a warning. The body was hung. The posse rode away. They didn't know what they'd done. They didn't know about the network. They didn't know about Dilger Ransom and the unborn child waiting at the farm in Atoka. They didn't know they'd just executed the only man in 3 states who'd been holding back something far older and far more dangerous than any organized outlaw band. They found out within 48 hours. Cassius Pettigrew was the first to reach the body. Alerted by a Comanche scout who'd been shadowing Walker as he rode north from the meeting with Donovan, Pettigrew cut the body down. He buried it in an unmarked grave in a place that has never been discovered. He then sent runners in every direction across the network. The runners carried no message except a date, a place, and a deck of playing cards from which 17 specific cards had been removed. The remaining members of the band and the inner circle of the support network understood. They knew what was being asked. Within 6 weeks, every man who'd been part of the posse that killed Jeremiah Walker, including Moriah Hollister, had been hunted down and killed, each shot once between the eyes, each left holding one of the 17 missing playing cards, each arranged in a pattern that was meaningless to the federal investigators who found the bodies. But that, when the cards were eventually combined and read in the order the men had died, spelled out, in a code based on a Comanche counting system, the simple words, "This debt is paid." Patrick Donovan, when he finally understood what had happened, requested a leave of absence from the Pinkerton agency. He went to Chicago. He spent 3 weeks drinking alone in a hotel room.
The cards in their hands spelled out a message encoded in a system the marshal recognized but could not interpret.
Resigning from the agency, that he could no longer continue in a profession that had used him,
came to lead the most
against
feared
his
outlaw
knowledge
band
and
American
against his
frontier
explicit
history.
assurances,
The war
to lure
ended
a
in
man
April
to his death under the
1865.
false promise
but along
of a
the western
federal
edge
pardon.
of the former Confederacy.
Pinkerton refused
They walked
to
west
accept
with
the
the clothes on
resignation.
their backs because the
He
South
explained,
they'd known had
in a
become a
private
slaughterhouse
meeting
for
Donovan
any black
recorded in
man
his
caught
journal
alone after dark.
that Moriah Hollister
Walker escaped
had
at
not been
15 in
operating under federal
1861
orders,
during the chaos of
that
the
his
early war,
actions had been
and made his way north
unauthorized
through the Mississippi
and
swamps to Union
were,
lines.
in a strict
The
legal
movement
sense,
here, it
a
mirrors the
state
crossing at
crime
Anti-Am, Chaplain.
that the federal
Indeed.
government could not be
Your
held
grasp
responsible.
of the terrain is remarkable,
Donovan
son.
understood this was true in the narrowest
By the
legal
spring of
sense and
1868,
false in
Walker
every
had assembled
meaningful
around him a
sense.
band so improbable in its
He
composition.
understood the federal
that Federal-
government
There were two white
had
men,
created the
both
conditions
Confederate
under
guerrillas
which
who'd ridden with
Hollister
William
could
Quantrill
believe
and had
his
no
orders
place
had
left
not
in the post-war
changed.
world. A Missourian named
By
Ellis
failing
Tatum.
to communicate the pardon to field operatives, by failing to coordinate the various agencies hunting Walker, by failing fundamentally to want Walker to live. He understood Walker had been killed not by Hollister, who'd merely fired the bullets, but by the United States government, which had decided an alternative American economy could not be allowed to exist. He stayed at the agency because he had nowhere else to go and a family to support. But he never worked another case in the territory, and he never spoke to Alan Pinkerton again, except through subordinates. He died in 1907 in Chicago of pneumonia at age 73. His last words, according to his daughter, who was present at the bedside, were the name, Jeremiah, repeated twice. What happened to Dilja Ransom and the child? You may ask. What happened to the network of 147 people who'd supported Walker for 5 years? What happened to the farm at Atoka where Walker had planned to live out his years as an ordinary man? The answers are recorded in pieces, in family histories, in the oral traditions of the freedmen and Choctaw and Comanche. But they've never been fully assembled, and probably never will be. Dilja Ransom gave birth to a son in May 1873. She named him Jeremiah after his father. She left the Choctaw Nation within a month of the birth, traveling first to New Orleans, and then by ship to Liberia, where a small community of black expatriates from the American South had been attempting, for 50 years, to build a free republic on the western coast of Africa. She arrived in Monrovia in November 1873. She lived there under the name Dilja Walker until her death in 1904. Her son grew up in Liberia, was educated at the College of West Africa, became a lawyer, and eventually returned to the United States in the 1910s, where he became one of the early organizers of what would eventually become the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He died in 1949 at Atlanta, having lived an entire life without ever publicly acknowledging the identity of his father, though he wrote in a private letter to his own son that he'd been told the story when he was 12 years old by his mother, and that he'd carried it with him every day of his life thereafter. The network of 147 people was never prosecuted. Donovan, in his last act of conscience as a Pinkerton agent, destroyed the list.
The cards in their
himself
hands
in the
spelled out a
fireplace of his
message
hotel
encoded
room
in a system the
Chicago
marshal
the week
recognized but
after
could not
he learned
interpret.
of Walker's death. The names existed nowhere else.
To grasp
The men
how an
and women
ex-slave
on the
came to
list
lead the
lived
most
out their
feared
lives
outlaw
in their
band American
towns
frontier history.
and on their farms across
The
the
war ended
territory,
in April 1865.
and the support they'd given Walker
But along the western
remained
edge of the
for
former
most of them a
Confederacy,
secret they shared
in-
only
They walked west with the
with
clothes
their
on their
children and
backs because the
grandchildren
South they'd known had
in
become a
private.
slaughterhouse for any black
Late at
man
night,
caught alone
when the
after
white
dark.
world was not listening,
Walker escaped
the
at
farm at
15 in
Atoka was burned to the
1861
ground
during
in
the chaos of the early war
1875 by
and
a
made his
group
way
of
north
night
through the
riders
Mississippi swamps to
associated
Union
with the early
lines.
Ku
The
Klux
movement
Klan,
here, it mirrors the
who'd
crossing
heard
at Anti-Am,
rumors it had
Chaplain.
once belonged
Indeed.
to Walker and
Your
wished to
grasp
make a
of the
statement.
terrain is remarkable, son.
The rumors were never confirmed.
By the
land
spring of
was sold for
1868,
taxes in
Walker had
1878
assembled around
to
him
a
a
white
band
settler
so
from
improbable in
Kansas
its
who had
composition
no idea
that
what he
Federal-
was
There were
buying.
two white men, both
The settler,
Confederate guerrillas who'd ridden
whose
with
name
William
was Ebenezer
Quantrill and had no
Crowley,
place left in the post-war world.
found when he
Missourian
plowed the
named
south
Ellis
field
Tatum.
for the first spring planting, a small leather pouch buried 6 inches below the surface. Inside the pouch were 20 gold double eagles, the last of the Choctaw annuity gold from the robbery of 1868, which Walker had buried on the farm he'd hoped to live on, perhaps as a kind of insurance perhaps simply as the habit of a man who'd spent his entire life expecting everything could be taken from him at any moment. Crowley sold the gold to a bank in Atoka, used the money to buy a team of mules, and lived a long, uneventful life on the land where Jeremiah Walker had hoped to raise his son. He never knew what he'd stumbled onto. He died in 1909, having mentioned the gold to no one but his wife. The story of Jeremiah Walker, the runaway slave who built the most dangerous gang the Western Territories had ever seen, was systematically suppressed by the federal government, by the Pinkerton Agency, by the cattle interests that profited from his death, and by the dominant historical narrative of the American West, which had no place for a black man on horseback with a Spencer carbine and a network of 147 people across 3 states willing to die to protect him. The story survived in fragments. In the songs black families in eastern Oklahoma still sing without quite knowing what they mean. In the playing cards that occasionally appear in antique markets of Fort Smith and Texarkana, with strange numerical markings on their backs. In a small obelisk in a forgotten cemetery in the Choctaw Nation that bears no name but is decorated every April 18 with a single bouquet of wild prairie flowers placed there by hands that have never been seen. And that, after 150 years, must now belong to the great-great-grandchildren of people who knew the truth and refused to let it die. This mystery shows us that the history we're taught is rarely the history that actually happened, and that the most dangerous men in any society are not those who kill and steal for personal gain, but those who refuse to accept that the world as they find it is the only world that can exist. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was Jeremiah Walker an outlaw, a hero, or something more complicated than either word can capture? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and
the
share
cards
with
in their
someone who
hands
loves
spelled out a
mysteries.
message encoded in a
See you in the
system the
next
marshal
one.